She spent $40,000 of her own money on her students. 15 years later, one came back. Dorothy Mae Simmons woke at 5:15 every morning, not because she had to, because there was always something left undone from the day before. A worksheet to finish, a letter to a parent she hadn't written yet, a list of names she carried in her head, each one with a need attached to it. Room 12, Garfield Elementary, south side of Chicago. 32 desks, most of them filled with children whose parents worked 2 jobs and came home too exhausted to ask what they'd learned that day. Children who were brilliant, and nobody had told them yet. Children who arrived hungry and couldn't concentrate by second period, but nobody called it hunger. They called it distracted. They called it unfocused. They wrote it in the comments section of a report card and sent it home in an envelope that sometimes got opened and sometimes didn't. Dorothy Mae was 27 when she started teaching. She had $28,000 in student loan debt, $380 in her checking account, and a 1987 Buick Skylark with a cracked rear window she'd been meaning to fix for 2 years. She had a salary that broke down to roughly $17 an hour when you divided it against the actual hours she put in. She had a studio apartment on the 2nd floor of a 3-flat on Halsted, a second-hand couch, and the absolute, unshakable, deeply unfashionable belief that every single child in that room was capable of something extraordinary, if one person refused to give up on them. She did not know yet what that belief was going to cost her. That first September, she noticed that 5 of her students arrived without having eaten breakfast. She started bringing a box of granola bars and leaving them on the edge of her desk each morning without comment. A child who wanted one could take one. Nobody had to ask. Nobody had to explain anything. Then a woman named Ruthie Gaines stopped her in the hallway after pickup one afternoon. Ruthie worked the overnight shift at a laundry service on the north side, and she looked like a person who had not slept a full night in recent memory. She said her son Jerome, who sat in the 2nd row and had been falling asleep by 10 a.m. since the 3rd week of school, hadn't eaten dinner the previous night. She said it the way people say things they are ashamed of, quickly, without looking up. Dorothy Mae thanked her for telling her. She said she would take care of it. She did not explain what that meant. The next morning, Jerome found a brown paper bag tucked inside his desk before he arrived. A cheese sandwich, an apple, a small bag of crackers. He looked around the room. Dorothy Mae was writing on the board with her back to him. He ate everything before the other children came in. After that first year, Dorothy Mae added up what she had spent out of her own pocket. $2,100. She sat with that number for a while. She had meant to spend nothing. She had told herself she would spend nothing. The school had a budget. The budget was what it was. She was a first-year teacher with debt and a cracked car window, and no business spending $2,100 she did not have on supplies and food and books and glasses and field trip fees for children whose families had already told her, quietly, apologetically, and that they couldn't make it work this time. She moved the number around in her mind like furniture she couldn't find a good place for. Then September came again. She told herself that second year that she had a system now. She was smarter now. She knew which expenses were truly necessary and which ones she had let herself be sentimental about. She made a list of things she would not buy. The list lasted until the 2nd week of October, when she found out that a girl named Nadine in the 4th row had been borrowing pencils from the child next to her every single day for 6 weeks because she had not one pencil of her own and was too afraid to ask. Dorothy Mae bought pencils. She bought enough that there would never be a child in her room without one. She threw the list away. By her 3rd year, she knew her students the way a doctor knows long-term patients. She knew which families were behind on rent and which ones had just caught up. She knew which children needed glasses. She bought glasses twice that year, telling the parents each time that she'd found a community health program that covered the cost. There was no program. She paid the optician directly and told him to send no paperwork to the school. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said he understood. She started writing grants, small ones, to foundations most people had never heard of, for amounts that felt almost embarrassing to request. $400 here, $750 there. She got good at it. She learned which sentences opened doors and which ones got filed in a drawer. She learned that funders wanted to read about measurable outcomes, so she started keeping records. A child named Roosevelt who'd come in reading at a second-grade level and left reading at a fifth-grade level after 1 year. A girl named Pamela who'd won a spoken word competition she'd never have entered if someone hadn't told her she had a voice worth using. Dorothy May kept those records in a spiral notebook she bought herself, because the school didn't ask her to keep them and she kept them anyway, because someday someone would need the evidence and she was going to have it. She applied for everything she could find, and she won more than she lost, and every dollar she won she spent on the children, and every dollar she lost she sometimes replaced with her own money anyway, quietly, without telling anyone, because the need did not pause while she waited to be approved. She bought a coat for a boy named Terence in November of her 5th year because his mother had told her in a phone call that the heat had been shut off. And she paused in the middle of that sentence, and Dorothy May understood what she was not saying. The next morning the coat was on his desk. It was the right size. She had measured his shoulders against the doorframe one afternoon while he was standing in it and done the calculation. She told him she'd found it in the lost and found. It wasn't. It was from the department store on 63rd Street where Dorothy May had driven after school the previous afternoon. Terence wore that coat for 2 winters. She never talked about any of it. That was a rule she made herself in the first year, and she kept it every year after. The moment a teacher makes her sacrifice visible, it becomes about the teacher. People start calling her selfless and inspiring, and the conversation moves away from the children and toward the person who helps them, and Dorothy May had no interest in that. She wanted her students to be the story. She was just the room they passed through. The year she thinks about most is her 9th year of teaching, the year Calvin Gaines walked into room 12. He was the son of Ruthie, the woman from the hallway. Ruthie had since moved twice, lost one job, found another, and somewhere in those years had gotten a little steadier on her feet. Not comfortable, not easy, but steadier. Calvin was 12 years old, and he came in late, 3 weeks into September on a Tuesday morning when Dorothy May was in the middle of explaining long division, and the door opened, and there he was. He was thin. He wore a jacket that was too small across the shoulders, and he carried a backpack with a broken zipper held together with a twist tie. He stood in the doorway and looked at the room the way a person looks at a situation they've been in before, and didn't enjoy the first time. Dorothy May had a rule about new students. She did not make them stand at the front and introduce themselves. She did not ask the class to welcome them. She just pointed to an empty desk and kept teaching. The child sat down. The room kept moving. They were in before they knew it. She pointed to the desk near the window. Calvin sat down. He didn't speak for the first 2 weeks. He answered direct questions with 1 or 2 words and looked back at his paper immediately after. He was not sullen, exactly. He was careful. He had the quality of someone who had learned to measure the temperature of a room before doing anything in it, and who had been burned often enough that the habit had become permanent. Dorothy May had seen that quality before. She had seen it in children who came from households where the ground shifted unpredictably. where you learned early that enthusiasm was a liability and that hope had a way of setting you up, where keeping yourself small and quiet and unreadable was not a character flaw, but a reasonable strategy developed in response to an unreasonable situation. She did not pathologize it. She did not try to fix it in the first week or the second. She just let him be in the room without asking anything of him that he wasn't ready to give. She did the same things she always did. She kept the granola bars on the desk. She made sure the classroom felt like a place where curiosity was safe. She called on students in a rotation so nobody could predict when their turn was coming, but nobody was singled out either. She laughed at things that were funny. She was serious about things that were serious. She held the room steady, the way a good room needs to be held, so that the children inside it could relax their vigilance just enough to actually learn something. Dorothy May noticed something in his second week. He was left-handed, and the composition notebook she'd ordered for the class had a metal spiral binding on the left side, which made writing painful and awkward for left-handed students. She'd never thought about it before. She ordered a set of left-handed spiral notebooks online that night, paid for them herself, and put one on Calvin's desk the next morning before school started. She didn't say anything. She didn't watch to see his reaction. She just put it there and moved on. He used it that day, and every day after. 3 weeks in, she found his journal. He had left it on his desk when the class went to the gymnasium for their weekly physical education period. She walked past his desk to close the window, and the journal was lying open. She saw the page before she could decide not to. It was covered in tiny, dense handwriting, and she stood there for a moment before she understood what she was reading. It was a story. A long, intricate story about a boy who discovered a door inside a city drainage tunnel that opened into a world made entirely of compressed memory. The sentences were careful and exact. The images were unlike anything she'd read from a 12-year-old, unlike most things she'd read from anyone. She closed the journal. She left it exactly where it was. She said nothing to Calvin when the class came back. But that afternoon, after the students went home, she pulled a chair over to the small classroom library shelf she maintained with her own books, and she found a copy of a short story collection she'd been meaning to put out for 2 years. Stories by a black author, a man named James, who had grown up on the south side of Chicago and written about people who lived in the spaces between what they'd been given and what they believed was possible. She had 3 copies because she'd found them at a library sale and bought all of them on instinct. She put 1 copy on the shelf directly adjacent to Calvin's desk, at eye level, with the spine facing out so the title was easy to read. She didn't point to it. She didn't mention it. She just made sure it was there. Calvin picked it up on a Thursday morning before the bell rang. He turned it over, read the back, opened it to the first page. He read 2 pages standing up before he registered that he was still standing. He sat down and kept reading. He finished it in 4 days. He came in on the 5th morning and put it back on the shelf. He stood there for a moment. He ran his finger along the spine once. Then he looked across the room at Dorothy May, who was grading papers at her desk and had been watching him from the edge of her peripheral vision for 4 days. Their eyes met. He nodded once. She nodded back. Nothing else was said. Nothing else needed to be. She did not make the moment larger than it was. She had learned over 9 years that the worst thing you could do to a private person finding their way toward something was to announce it, to call the room's attention to it, to make the child feel observed in a way that made the whole enterprise feel fragile and public. She just nodded and looked back at her papers. The moment went back underground where it belonged. She knew it was still growing down there. She began to find ways to feed what she'd seen in that journal. She slipped extra writing prompts into his packet, 3 or 4 pages beyond what the other students received, framed as optional extension work, so he had a choice. But the invitation was clear. She entered one of his stories in the Young Voices writing competition run by the Chicago Public Library without telling him. She submitted it under his name exactly as he'd written it, changing nothing, because it needed nothing changed. He won 3rd place in the 11 to 14 age category. The certificate arrived at the school office addressed to Calvin Gaines. Dorothy May picked it up from the front desk on a Wednesday afternoon, slipped it into a plain manila envelope, and put it on his desk Thursday morning before he arrived. She was at the board writing the day's agenda when he walked in, sat down, opened the envelope, and read what was inside. She did not look up from the board. She could hear the quality of the silence behind her. Change. He sat with the certificate for a long time. She could feel it. Then she heard the soft sound of it being folded and placed carefully inside the front pocket of his binder. He didn't say anything that day, or the next. On the Friday of that week, at the end of the last period, when the other students had filed out and Calvin was collecting his things, he stopped at her desk. He said, "Thank you, Miss Simmons." She said, "You did that yourself, Calvin. I just mailed an envelope." He thought about that for a moment. Then he left. His mother, Ruthie, came in for the parent conference that November. She arrived 10 minutes early, which told Dorothy May something about the kind of woman she was. She wore her work clothes, the dark blue uniform of the laundry service, because she'd come straight from a shift. She sat down across from Dorothy May and folded her hands on the table and looked like someone who had learned to brace for news over many years of receiving it. She said, before Dorothy May could begin, "I know he's been quiet. I know that seems like a problem. He gets that from his father, who I haven't talked about yet with any of his teachers." She paused. "I just need to know what we're dealing with so I can figure out how to help him." Dorothy May leaned forward. She said, "Mrs. Gaines, I want to tell you something, and I need you to let it land before you respond." Ruthie went still. Dorothy May said, "Your son is the most gifted young writer I have encountered in 9 years of teaching. He has an imagination and a command of language that most adults spend their whole lives chasing and never catch. I've entered one of his stories in a citywide competition. He placed 3rd out of 400 submissions. He is 12 years old." Ruthie said nothing. Her hands were still folded on the table. Dorothy May said, "I am telling you this because he needs you to know it. Not from me, from you. He needs to hear from you that you see it." Ruthie unfolded her hands. She put one of them over her mouth. She looked at the window for a moment. When she looked back, she said, "He writes all the time. I thought it was him avoiding things." Dorothy May said, "It is the thing. It's not the avoidance. It's the thing itself." Ruthie made a sound that wasn't quite a word. She nodded slowly. She looked at her hands again. Then she said quietly, "His father used to read everything, every night. We didn't have a lot of books, but he'd get them from the library and read them out loud to Calvin when he was small." She paused. "Calvin hasn't talked about him since he left, but I suppose some things get passed down whether we talk about them or not." Dorothy May let that sit. She thought about all the things that get passed down without being named, the way a child carries a parent's gift inside them like a seed and doesn't know it yet, the way absence shapes a person just as surely as presence does. Calvin had never told her about his father. He had never mentioned him at all. But she had noticed that the subjects he chose for his stories were always about people navigating between 2 worlds, 2 loyalties, 2 versions of who they might become. She had thought that was imagination. She understood now it was autobiography. Then she said, "He's going to need someone to keep telling him that this matters. The world is going to tell him a lot of other things, louder things, things that have money and urgency behind them. I need you to be louder than those things." Ruthie looked at her steadily. She said, "I can do that." She stood, shook Dorothy May's hand, and left. In the hallway, Dorothy May heard her stop walking for a moment. Then she heard her keep going. Calvin stayed in room 12 for 1 full school year and 3 months of the next, before Ruthie was offered a better-paying position with a cleaning company that serviced office buildings in a suburb 40 minutes north of the city. The pay was $4 more an hour and came with health insurance, which Ruthie had not had in 6 years. There was no reasonable version of the decision that didn't involve moving. Calvin came to tell Dorothy May on his last Wednesday. He stood in the doorway of room 12 after school with his backpack on, and his broken zipper bag now repaired with an actual zipper pull that Dorothy May had quietly bought, and slipped into his desk one morning alongside a note that said it belonged to his bag now. He said, "Ms. Simmons, I'm leaving Friday." She said, "I know. Your mother called." He said, "I wanted to say I'm going to keep writing." She said, "I know that too." He looked at his shoes for a moment, then he looked back up. He said, "Do you think it matters? What I write?" He asked it the way young people ask the questions they've been holding the longest, quickly and without warning, like releasing pressure before the moment passes. Dorothy May looked at him steadily. She said, "Calvin, I want you to think about something. Every story you write puts a version of the South Side on a page that might otherwise not exist. Every time you describe what it feels like to be exactly where you are, in the skin you're in the rooms you've lived in, you are doing something that has always mattered and always will." She paused. "The question isn't whether it matters. The question is whether you'll trust that it does long enough to do the work." He thought about that. He nodded slowly the way someone nods when they're filing something away. He said, "I'm going to get published someday." Dorothy May looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Calvin, you already won a citywide competition. You're already published in the competition anthology. It already started." He blinked. He hadn't thought of it that way. She said, "Don't let anyone tell you it has to look a certain way before it counts." "It counts now. You started now." He stood there for another moment. Then he said, "Okay." He hitched his backpack up on his shoulders and walked down the hallway. At the far end, he turned around once. She lifted a hand. He turned back around and was gone. She went back into room 12. She had 29 other students who needed her attention in the morning, and so she sat down at her desk and kept going. That was 15 years ago. Dorothy May was 42 now. She still taught at Garfield Elementary. She still got to school before anyone else. Room 12 still had 32 desks, still had the left-handed spiral notebooks she now ordered as a matter of course for any student who needed them, still had the granola bars on the corner of her desk every morning. He still had the library shelf she maintained herself with books she bought or found at sales or accepted from the donations box she'd put up near the office 3 years ago that most people walked past. But some people used. She had spent, by a rough calculation she'd done one evening on the back of a grant application she was procrastinating on, somewhere close to $40,000 of her own money across 15 years of teaching. Food, supplies, glasses, books, field trip fees, entry fees for competitions, postage, the cost of laminating a certificate someone else should have been paying to laminate, the coat for Terence, the notebooks, the optician who agreed to send no paperwork. She had added it up slowly, going back through bank records she didn't fully want to look at, and she sat with the number when she found it. $40,000. She tried to feel something clear about it, regret or pride or some version of both. What she mostly felt was tired. Not the tired of someone who had made the wrong choices, but the tired of someone who had made the only choices she could have made given who she was, and who understood that there is a difference between the two, but that the difference does not necessarily make you less tired. She had not told anyone. Not her mother, who still lived 4 miles away and called every Sunday. Not her friend Loretta, who had taught 4th grade down the hall for 11 years and was the closest thing Dorothy May had to a witness in that building. Not the principal, Eugene Watkins, who treated Dorothy May with a kind of quiet or careful respect she had come to understand meant he knew exactly what she was doing and felt guilty that the district didn't do more about it. She did not tell anyone because she knew what would happen if she did. People would say she was remarkable. They would say she was selfless. They would write a piece about her in the neighborhood paper, and she would be photographed standing in front of her whiteboard with her arms crossed and a smile she did not quite feel. And it would change nothing structural about the situation. And the next September she would still walk into a classroom where some children had not eaten, and the budget would still be what it was, and she would still be standing there trying to close the distance with her own hands. She was tired in a way that a weekend didn't touch any more. It wasn't that she had stopped loving the work. She hadn't. She still felt something tighten and quicken in her chest on the first day of every school year when she looked at her new class and tried to figure out who each of them was going to be. She still believed what she'd believed at 27. But her car, now a 2004 Chevrolet Malibu with 140,000 miles on it, needed a new transmission she'd been putting off for 4 months because she didn't have $2,800. Her student loans were not paid off. They were on an income-based repayment plan that had been running for 14 years and still had years left. The district had trimmed the per-classroom supply budget for the 3rd year in a row. And there were evenings when she sat in her car in the school parking lot and let herself think, very quietly, very briefly, the way you let yourself look at something you don't want to look at, that she had poured everything she had into this, and there was not a lot left in the pitcher. She thought about those evenings sometimes during the day when the room was noisy and she was running on 6 hours of sleep, and the copy machine was jammed again, and one of her students was having a crisis that the school counselor was too overloaded to handle, so she was handling it herself. During her prep period, in the hallway, with her lunch getting cold on her desk, she thought about her friend Loretta, who had left teaching 3 years ago to work in corporate training, and now made $30,000 more a year and took actual vacations and never once came home and graded papers until midnight. Loretta called sometimes and asked how she was doing, and Dorothy May said fine and meant it mostly, but not entirely. She thought about what she would say if someone asked her whether it had been worth it. She thought she would say yes. She thought she would say yes the way you say yes to a thing that has cost you something real, which is a different yes than the one you say to a thing that costs nothing. A heavier yes, a more deliberate one. Then she would go home. She would eat dinner. She would grade papers. She would look up a grant deadline she'd forgotten about and start the application. She would set her alarm for 5 a.m. and go to sleep. She did not tell anyone that either. On a Thursday in October, Eugene Watkins knocked on the door of her classroom during her prep period. She assumed budget meeting. Curriculum update, a form she'd forgotten to sign. She had a mug of tea going cold on her desk, and she brought it with her. Eugene was standing in his doorway instead of sitting behind his desk, which was the first unusual thing. He said, "Dorothy, there's someone here who'd like to speak with you." He said it the way a person says something when they've been asked to keep a secret and are finding it difficult. She walked in. There was a man sitting in the chair across from Eugene's desk. He stood when she came in. He was tall, late 20s, wearing a dark jacket that was well made without making a point of it. He had a phone in his hand that went immediately into his jacket pocket the moment she appeared, the deliberate gesture of someone who had made a decision about how to be present and held to it. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't name right away, the expression of someone confirming something they've believed for a long time, but haven't had proof of until now. She looked back at him. She knew that face. It took her 3 full seconds, which felt much longer, because the face had changed the way faces change over 15 years. Filled out, settled, the boy's softness replaced by something more defined. But the eyes were the same. The eyes had that same quality she remembered, watchful, careful. Measuring the temperature before committing, she said, "Calvin." He smiled, not a wide smile. The kind of smile that contains a lot of things that aren't smiles, that have been waiting a long time to be something else. He said, "Miss Simmons." Eugene excused himself. The door closed. They stood in that office in the particular stillness of people who have a great deal of time between them and are trying to figure out how to put it down without dropping it. He told her what 15 years looked like from where he was standing. He'd moved to the suburbs with his mother and finished middle school and gone to a high school where the English teacher read one of his stories out loud to the class his sophomore year, which he told Dorothy May about the way you tell someone about the moment you understood something you'd been told was true but hadn't felt yet in your body. He said the teacher had paused after she finished reading it and looked at the class and said, "Whoever wrote this should be a writer." And the class had looked around at each other, and he had looked at his desk. But he had heard it. He had written it in his journal that evening with the date next to it. He had a record of every time anyone had said something like that to him, going back to the Young Voices competition certificate. He kept the record the way you keep evidence of something you're not entirely sure you're allowed to believe. He'd applied to 3 universities and been accepted to 2. He'd chosen the one in Michigan because it offered him more financial aid and because it had a writing program run by a professor who'd published 6 novels and whose work Calvin had read 3 times. He'd introduced himself to that professor in the first week of school by handing him a folder with 12 pages of writing inside it and saying nothing. The professor had read it and called him into his office the next day. They had worked together for 3 years. He'd studied English. He'd written constantly. He'd also, running alongside the writing like a parallel track he didn't entirely understand at first, become fascinated by systems, by the infrastructure of things, by the way large organizations moved information around and where they lost it. His mother had spent 15 years in cleaning and laundry services and had told him more than she knew about the gaps in how hospitals and healthcare facilities managed their supply chains and their staff communications. In his 3rd year of school, he started building something, a software platform designed to fix a specific, unglamorous, expensive problem that large healthcare facilities had with tracking equipment and scheduling maintenance. He was not, he said, trying to make it dramatic. He'd had help. He'd made good hires. He'd been lucky in some of the ways that looked like skill from the outside. The company had grown slowly, then not slowly. He was 29 years old, and what he'd built was worth considerably more than he'd ever imagined anything bearing his name could be worth when he was 12 years old, sitting in a classroom on the south side of Chicago, wearing a jacket that was too small. He told Dorothy May that he had thought about her consistently across all of it, not in a sentimental way, or not only. In the specific architectural way a person thinks about the moment something was made possible. The left-handed notebook, the book that appeared on a shelf at eye level, the certificate in the manila envelope on a Thursday morning. The parent conference where his mother came in braced for difficulty and left with something different on her face. These were not small things, he said. He was precise about this. These were not gestures of charity or pity. These were the actions of someone who looked at him and saw what was actually there, at a point in his life when the weight of everything around him made it very difficult to see it himself. When you are 12 years old and the world is busy explaining to you what you are limited to, one person who sees past that explanation doesn't just feel good. It changes the architecture of what you believe is possible. It becomes load-bearing. He had been looking for her for just under a year, not because she was hard to find. She was not hard to find. She was exactly where she had always been, which he said quietly, and which Dorothy May heard quietly, and which sat between them for a moment before he continued. He pulled a folder from the bag he'd set beside the chair. He set it on the desk and pushed it toward her. He said, "I want to show you something, and then I want to ask you something." She took the folder. Inside was the founding charter of an organization he had incorporated 7 months earlier. He had not announced it. He had not filed a press release. He had been waiting because he'd needed to do one thing first, and he hadn't been able to do that thing until he found her. The organization was called the Room 12 Initiative. Dorothy May put the folder down. She picked it back up. She read the mission statement twice. The Room 12 Initiative existed to provide direct financial grants to teachers in under-resourced schools. Not to the schools themselves, not to district administrators, not to programs or initiatives or task forces, to the individual teachers, to put money into the hands of the people who were already spending their own money because the need was in front of them and they could not look away from it. The grants were unrestricted. No reporting requirements beyond a simple annual statement, no designated use. The teacher knew what was needed. The teacher had always known what was needed. The grant was the trust made tangible. The first round of funding was $2.1 million, 210 teachers, $10,000 each. The number $2.1 million was not an accident. She had spent $2,100 in her first year of teaching. He had not forgotten that number. He had, she would find out later, been given that number by his mother, who had been walking past the office one afternoon years ago and overheard Dorothy May mention it to another teacher in the hallway. Quietly, as an aside, with the tone of someone making a private accounting. Ruthie had gone home and told Calvin. Calvin had written it down in his journal. The journal he had always kept because a teacher once put a notebook made for left-handed people on his desk without saying a word, and that act had told him, more clearly than any announcement ever could, that his particular way of moving through the world was not a problem to be accommodated, but a fact to be honored. At the bottom of the founding charter, below the mission statement and the board composition and the grant criteria, there was a single line. This organization is named in honor of Room 12, Garfield Elementary School, Chicago, see Illinois, and of Dorothy May Simmons, who understood that seeing a child clearly is not a passive act. Dorothy May sat with that line for a long time. He was quiet. She had taught him that, she realized. She had been quiet with him at every critical moment, letting the thing breathe, letting him come to it in his own time. He had learned the lesson and was returning it to her now. She said, "Calvin, how did you know the exact number?" "The $2,100. He said, "My mother. She heard you say it once, and she told me that night." He paused. He said, "I wrote it down because by then I wrote everything down." He paused again. He said, "You taught me to do that." Dorothy May looked at the ceiling of Eugene Watkins's office. There was a water stain in the far corner she'd been looking at for 9 years. She looked at it now. She was not a person given to public emotion. She had cried exactly twice in this building in 15 years. She did not cry now, but there was something moving through her that she did not have a precise word for. A loosening of something that had been held very tightly for a very long time. The particular physical sensation of being known by someone who had the evidence. She said, "I didn't do it for this." He said, "I know." He said, "That's the only reason I'm here." The Room 12 initiative was announced publicly 4 weeks later. It was covered by 3 Chicago news outlets and then picked up nationally because of the specificity of the story and because Calvin told it with the precision and patience of someone who had spent his life learning how to make a reader feel the weight of a detail. He did not make it a story about himself. He made it a story about Dorothy May, and then, by extension, about every teacher like her. He named the left-handed notebook. He named the story Collection on the Shelf. He named the certificate in the envelope. He named the parent conference and what it had done to his mother's face. He described each thing slowly in the order it happened, the way a person builds a case, not to persuade but to document. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, and here is what each thing weighed. He was asked in every interview some version of the same question. Why teachers specifically? Why not a scholarship fund for students, or funding for new school buildings, or any of the other more visible, more legible places money could go in an under-resourced school system? He answered it the same way every time. He said, "Because the teachers are already doing it. They are already spending their own money. They are already staying late and writing grants and buying glasses and coats and notebooks and finding competitions to enter their students in, and doing all of it without being asked to and without being compensated for it and without a great deal of acknowledgement from anyone." He said, "The question isn't what will the money fix. The question is, who is already fixing it? And why are we making them pay for the privilege?" People heard that. Newspapers reprinted it. Someone put it on a sign. Dorothy May's phone rang for 10 days. She answered some of the calls. In every interview, she redirected the conversation. She said there were 209 other teachers receiving the same grant, and they were the story. She named 3 of them by name in every interview until their names appeared in the coverage instead of hers. She went back to Room 12, 32 desks, 28 students that year, granola bars on the corner of the desk, left-handed notebooks in the supply cabinet for the first time purchased by someone other than Dorothy May, a classroom library shelf that was, for the first time in 15 years, stocked with more books than she could read in a semester because people had heard about it and sent donations, and she'd accepted everyone. She had a car that no longer needed a transmission she couldn't afford. Because Calvin had arranged it through the school office 3 days after their meeting in a way that was quiet and would not embarrass her, which was the most important part. Which he had known was the most important part, because she had taught him, without ever saying so directly, that the way you help someone matters as much as whether you help them. She sat at her desk in the half-hour before school started on the Monday, after everything had happened, and looked at her room. She thought about Dorothy May Simmons at 27, driving a Buick with a cracked rear window, carrying $28,000 in debt and $380 in her checking account, and a certainty that had no rational basis. That what happened in this room mattered. That the children in these desks were worth more than the systems around them were spending on them. That someone who chose to see that clearly and act on it accordingly was not being naive or sentimental, but was in fact making a completely logical bet on the most important variable in the equation. She had not done any of it for this. That was still true. She would have kept doing it if Calvin had moved across the country and built something extraordinary and never thought of her again. She would have kept doing it until there was nothing left to give. This was not noble. It was not especially rational. It was just the shape of who she was, the way some people are built to move toward a problem and some people are built to move away. And she had always moved toward. But this was also real. Being seen was real. Having someone say, "I remember the notebook, I remember the shelf. I remember what my mother's face looked like when she came home from that conference. I counted what you spent in year 1, and I kept the number for 15 years. That was real. That was its own kind of thing, a kind of completion she hadn't known she was waiting for. She had a student that year named Delia who reminded her of nobody in particular but had the same quality she'd first seen in Calvin. That watchful stillness, that talent being kept low and quiet, like a fire someone was trying to make sure didn't get noticed. Dorothy May had already moved a shelf. She had already put something on it. She was already watching from the edge of her peripheral vision to see when Delia would pick it up. That was the work. That was still the work. The recognition and the grant and the news coverage had changed the supply budget and fixed her car, and given 209 other teachers a little more room to breathe. It had not changed the fundamental nature of what needed to happen in room 12 every morning at 7:45 a.m. Dorothy May set her coffee down and opened her gradebook. There are teachers right now sitting in rooms like room 12. There are classrooms with 32 desks and a supply budget that runs out in February, and a teacher who has been to the dollar store on her own time and her own dime, more times than she has counted. There are children in those rooms who have not been told yet what they're carrying, who have been told other things instead. Logistical things, behavioral things, things about what is realistic and what isn't, and who have not yet met the person who will look at them from across a room and simply not agree. Some of those children are sitting very still and very quiet right now, the way Calvin sat very still and very quiet, conserving something that hasn't found a safe place to go yet. Some of them are doing exactly what they've been told to do and surviving it and waiting for a different set of instructions from someone they trust. Some of them already know what they love, but don't know yet that loving it is permitted, that it counts, that it could be the thing they build a life on rather than the thing they do in secret after everything else is done. They are waiting for someone to notice. Most of the people who could be that person look away, not out of cruelty, out of exhaustion, for out of a system that tells them the job description ends at curriculum delivery. Out of the arithmetic of need that feels so enormous that one person's contribution seems too small to register. Out of the very reasonable fear that if you start looking clearly at what is in front of you, you will be unable to stop, and the cost of not stopping is high. Dorothy May Simmons never believed that arithmetic. She never believed that the size of the problem was an argument against showing up. She believed the opposite. She believed that the size of the problem was exactly the reason to show up, that the fact that one person's contribution was small compared to the total need was not an argument for doing nothing, but an argument for doing the specific thing you could do as well as you could do it, for as long as you could do it, and trusting that other people were doing the same thing in their own rooms that you'd never see and couldn't count. For 15 years, she threw everything she had at it, and Calvin Gaines caught it, and he held it for 15 years. And then he built something with it that now reaches 210 teachers in 8 cities, and those teachers reach thousands of children, and some of those children will catch something and hold it and build something with it in their turn. That is how it moves. When it moves, one person decides to see clearly. One child feels the weight of being seen. One life gets built on that foundation instead of on rubble. And that life, if it goes well and if the person is paying attention, finds a way to go back and shore up the foundation for someone else. Dorothy May learned to see clearly at 27. Calvin learned to build at 29. And somewhere right now there is a child at a desk who is going to learn something from a teacher who has never been on television and never will be, who drives a car with something wrong with it that she hasn't had time to fix, who stays late on Tuesdays writing grant applications for $400 that she may or may not receive, who notices that a child is left-handed and goes home that evening and orders a different kind of notebook. That teacher will not know what she started. She will just start it. And that is everything. That has always been everything. The not knowing and the starting anyway. The throwing without being certain anyone will catch. The keeping of the room steady so the children inside it can relax their vigilance just enough to discover what they carry. The cycle does not break, unless someone decides to break it. Dorothy May decided at 27. Calvin decided at 29. Every child in room 12 is still deciding. And somewhere there is a child at a desk right now who hasn't found their notebook yet. Their teacher is out there. So are you.